Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Hail, friend. Welcome back to Delingpole, the podcast brought to you by Podcast One and Breitbart, featuring me, James Delingpole. Now, I'm often accused of climate alarmists on Twitter and places like that of not talking to enough real scientists. So this week, for a change, I thought I would talk to a real scientist. A real scientist, by the way, who does not believe in man-made global warming. His name is quite familiar to skeptics and alarmists alike. His name is Tim Ball, Professor Tim Ball. He's a Canadian geographer, a retired professor. He knows a lot about climate change, and because he's taken the wrong side as far as the alarmists are concerned, he has become their hate figure, and they've launched several lawsuits against him. He's suffered very personally. He could have had a very happy, comfortable retirement. Instead, he's spent all his retirement funds — I feel sorry for his poor old wife who has to put up with this as well — all his retirement funds have gone on defending himself against vexatious legal actions brought against him by the Greenies. So, without further ado, welcome to this week's special guest, Dr. Tim Ball. You're listening to Delingpole, brought to you by Podcast One and Breitbart. Have fun. So, my special guest today is Dr. Tim Ball. And funnily enough, only a week ago, somebody on Twitter said to me, why don't you interview Tim Ball? And here I am in Washington, D.C. with the man in front of me. Welcome to the show, Dr. Tim Ball.
Well, thank you. And of course, Einstein said there's no such thing as coincidence. Our brains can detect energies and things that we're not even aware of. So this is not purely a chance. This was predestined.
It was meant to be. Now, one of the things that the greenie trolls are often saying to me on Twitter is, why don't you talk to a real scientist, a real climate scientist? So just remind me what your degree is, Dr. Ball.
Well, I have a PhD in historical climatology from Queen Mary College at University of London of England. And the whole thing was planned because most students go to university, they haven't got a clue what they're doing. And I agree with Aristotle. You shouldn't be allowed to study subjects until you've got life experience. So I had served almost 10 years in the Canadian Air Force. And that had got my interest in 5 years of that, by the way, with search and rescue in the Arctic, which was an incredible experience. But I lost my flying category because of hearing problems, and so I took a small cash settlement from the government and went back to university at the age of 30. And I thought, weather and climate, that's a really interesting, quiet, no politics there area, and walked into the buzz bomb. And of course, I've been at it so long that when I was started, the global cooling was the consensus, and I've watched these political cycles and climate cycles come and go, and we're now on another one of a new government, and a cooling cycle is underway. So it's been a very interesting up and down ride.
Why do you think so many of your contemporaries, or so it seems, have gone to the other side? That they're promoting alarmism about the environment.
Well, one of the most frightening things I saw in my 25 years in university was it went from publish or perish, which of course in itself was kind of directing people to produce papers just for the sake of producing them, into get funding or perish. What happened was in the 60s and 70s, with the government's the economic collapse or downturn, governments started cutting back on funding, and of course universities, especially in North America, were part of that. The universities realized, and this is not an unreasonable thing, they realized that they were providing facilities for faculty to do research. So they said, look, why don't we just skim 35% off the top of any research fund that a faculty member gets? Because we're giving them space and we're providing heat and light and everything else. Say, not unreasonable. The problem is what it did was that it made the faculty that brought in large amounts of funding more important than anyone else. And that then started driving this search for funding. And people very quickly learned, the keywords that you needed to put on, or the places where you could get research funding. Just to give you an idea of how I realized what was going on is 30 years ago, I realized governments were funding two things: climate, global warming, and AIDS. So I, tongue-in-cheek, submitted an application for funding to research the connection between climate and AIDS. I thought I'd ride two hobby horses. Of course, I got thrown out right away. But for me, it was illustrative of what was going on. And then when you look at the amount of government funding that went towards this, Joanne Nova's, the Australian website, her studies on it, I mean, we're talking billions of dollars.
Well, trillions.
Or trillions, yeah.
$1.5 trillion per year
Yeah.
is the figure I often hear quoted. That's a lot of money. That's the same amount, well, it was about 2 years ago, the same amount that people spend on online shopping around the world annually. So that's a lot of people are dependent for their mortgages and their children's education on that.
Yeah, and of course one can understand. I mean, it's like with I gave a talk in Winnipeg, Canada, one time, and there were three government employees of Environment Canada, the Weather Office, and they came up after and said, "We agree with you, but we daren't say it because we'll be out of a job." And I have some sympathy for that, mortgages and jobs and children, but unfortunately, it means that the whole corruption continues. And of course, one of the things I've always raised the point about is that here we've got supposedly open free speech society, but we have to protect whistleblowers. I mean, there's something wrong with that absolute contradiction of ideas. But the funding was the big issue that drove it. The other thing was the new paradigm of environmentalism. And as you know, paradigm shifts come in, and what happens with them is a few people look at it and say, hey, there's power and money opportunities there, and they grab it, which is what the extreme environmentalists did. The majority of people are sitting there saying, well, it's a good idea, but how far do we go with this? And they don't know how far to go. And then this is when I came to the realization of the role of extremists in our society, because their role is to define the limits for the majority. And with the feminists, another great paradigm shift of the 20th century. And the majority of women were saying, well, how far do we go with this? And then women started burning bras, and the average woman said, sorry, no, I need that. That's going too far. So the limit was defined for them. And still things need to be changed. Well, the environmental thing became the new paradigm shift. And, of course, if you weren't on board with it, you were immediately branded anti-planet, anti-future, anti-children. And the whole moral high ground that they took, which, by the way, became available to them because of the collapse of religion. So that all of these dynamics working together gave the environmentalists the moral high ground, and they've ridden it for power and profit ever since.
And it was it not, one of your compatriots who started all this, Maurice Strong. Tell us about the role of Maurice Strong in all this.
You're going to take the English out of that. He's Maurice Strong.
Oh, is he Maurice?
Maurice. He wanted to be called Maurice.
Okay.
He's born in Oak Lake, Manitoba, and a little community I visited, and I talked to people that grew up with him. The prairies of Canada and the United States, when he grew up in the 20s and 30s, there was a very strong move to socialism. They saw the damages of the collapse of the market and all the rest of it. So his family came from a very strong socialist background. In Canada, it was called the CCF, the Cooperative Something Federal, And his aunt, Anna Strong, actually declared herself a Marxist at the age of 15, and she went off to China and reportedly had an affair with Mao Zedong. So it comes from a very strong socialist background, but he left there, went to the States, became an industrialist. And like so many of these people, once they get wealthy, the guilt of that, and then their socialism comes back. But Strong had two great abilities, and this is the thing we should never underestimate. There's genius and then there's evil genius. And it's not the talent, but it's how you use it. Well, Strong saw that using environmentalism and climate was the perfect vehicle to push a global agenda. Socialist agenda, yeah, a one-world government agenda. And he'd advocated for this for some time. By that time, he's very... I don't know if you remember that Get Smart series where they had that Mr. Wonderful that he just talked to you and his eyes would sparkle and you absolutely fell under his spell. Well, that's what I've heard from people who worked for Maurice Strong. He could persuade anybody about anything, and so he got into very powerful positions. But there's a marvelous book by Elaine Dewar called The Cloak of Green. And it was an interesting exercise, and it's a pity more journalists aren't doing it. But Elaine set out to write a book praising Canadian environmentalists like Maurice Strong and Elizabeth May and David Suzuki. But the more she did her research, the more she realized these people were far left and more corrupt than the people that they were attacking. And so her whole thesis of the book changed. And I spoke to her about 5 years ago. I said, you need to update it. She said I wouldn't touch it. I've had death threats, the most hatred, anything I ever wrote. She said I wouldn't go near it again. But she interviewed Maurice Strong, spent 5 days at the United Nations with him. And she said, well, what are the problems? And he did it in a sort of hypothetical way. So, where he said, well, imagine a group of powerful leaders sitting around saying, what's the problem with the planet? And the answer is that the developed nations, the use of fossil fuels and destroying and using up resources too quickly. And he said they decide that what they need to do is get rid of the developed nations, industrialized nations. And then he said, and they said, isn't it our responsibility to do that? Well, if you think, and then Dewar concluded that what Strong was doing was using the United Nations for that objective, because she said to him, well, you got that big idea, why don't you run for politics? And he said, can't do anything as a politician. It's kind of like Conrad Black, Conrad, his wonderful, and I love these kinds of comments that are sleepers. They said to Conrad, well, why aren't you in politics? And he said, I don't need to be.
Yeah.
And it says it all, Well, Dewar said to Maurice Strong, well, how are you going to implement this idea if you're not going to politics? He said, I'm going to go to the UN where I can get all the money I want, not be accountable to anybody, which, of course, is precisely what he did. And he set up the United Nations Environment Program, the Rio Conference, at which he introduced Agenda 21. And by the way, in that same year, 1992, and this is a very important object lesson for the world, he was also appointed chairman of Ontario Hydro. Now, in Canada, because hydroelectricity is the major source of power in most of the provinces, the government agency that controls all power within a province, so it's literally centralized socialist power, is called a hydro. And he took over Ontario Hydro and implemented all of the things that are being proposed for the green agenda, that is to shut down the coal plants. I mean, it's what Obama's thing, shut down the coal plants, get rid of nuclear, put up wind turbines. And he did that in Ontario to the point where they're going to be behind in terms of energy production for another 40 years. The people in Ontario pay a surcharge to cover the damage that he did when he was put in charge of Ontario Hydro in 1992. So he actually put into practice what he promoted through the United Nations and this whole IPCC and CO2 problem. So it's really an object lesson of what's going on.
So you see the United Nations as the main driver of global climate policy and global warming scaremongering?
Yeah, and because my personal view is that the only thing you get with bigger government is more corruption. Nothing else improves. And I gave a talk in Phoenix just recently at the Freedom Conference down there. And I don't know if you know anything about statistics, but in statistics there's a thing called degrees of freedom. And degrees of freedom are the influence or effect of a single variable. If the more variables you have, the more each variable loses its degree of freedom. And I think that's analogous to society, that if you've got two people get together, they agree to. They give up some freedoms for some benefits. But the more people you add to the group, the more the individual loses freedom until once you get to a world level. And by the way, it was interesting, Theresa May, the new Prime Minister of Britain, made a very interesting comment where she said that if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, which is a very telling comment about her thinking about things. And so the United Nations was the vehicle that Maurice Strong chose. And, of course, the other way that he used it, just to give you an idea of how devious this guy was, and I really mean devious, because to me, trying to control other people's lives in any way, shape, or form is a form of deviousness and manipulation. But you notice the role of the Maldives in those South Pacific islands. Yeah. Well, it wasn't just that they were threatened by sea level change, although that's what they told them. And Strong said, look, we'll get you money because of the sea level change. But it was because each of them had a vote equal to China and equal to the U.S. So he was able to garner 62 or 63 votes out of all of those little islands, which guaranteed him passing any legislation in the UN.
So you're saying it's Maurice Strong who is responsible for this whole notion about the sinking Maldives and the sinking Tuvalu and...
Yeah, because, well, I mean, not he specifically, but it's kind of like the Henry II thing. You know, won't anybody rid me of this damn priest? Well, the people at the top set the objective and the tone and the method for the people beneath them. Right. And so Strong, and I mean what the other thing that everybody I spoke to will tell you about him was his organizational skills. He was brilliant at setting up bureaucracies. And, of course, one of the things that he did was he set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change through the World Meteorological Organization. And the WMO is made up of the bureaucrats from each national weather office from every country in the world. So once you got them involved, and them, they're the ones that were used to set up this whole CO2 global warming thing, they then go back and convince their politicians, oh, this is fine. I mean, it's no coincidence that the chair of the founding meeting of the IPCC in Villach, Austria in 1985 was a guy by the name of Gordon McBean, and he was the Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment Canada.
Canadians are just evil, aren't they? But what's going on here? How come so many of the world's ills are being generated by Canadians?
Well, I think part of it is because people see them as kind and they let them in the door and they don't know what they're doing, it's an amazing thing that a country of only 38 million people, but it's of course part of it is related to the underlying socialism in Canada.
Where does that come from? Immigrants. Poor Scottish and Irish immigrants, or what?
Yes, I think that's a lot of it. Certainly the Scottish, and then also, of course, you see Eastern Canada especially is made up of what they call the United Empire Loyalists. Now, these were people who were opposed to the American Revolution and the whole idea of American exceptionalism and freedom of the individual. So they fled into Canada to get away from that. And there were certain groups, for example, in Nova Scotia, you've got the Acadians, who are a French-speaking people. Well, they're actually originally Cajuns from Louisiana, and they fled to get away from the American system. And so you've got a nation that's formed around total obeisance to government and total government control.
And, of course, that French streak as well. The French love big government, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. It's I mean, they pretend to be free and opposing it, but it's just a farce. So Canada has this background. Then, of course, as I said, the hardship of the 30s and the Dust Bowl on the prairies and all the rest of this stuff, which created people like Maurice Strong.
That's fascinating. More in a moment. You're listening to Delingpole with this week's special guest, Dr. Tim Ball.
Okay, face it. You love to binge, on good stuff like cookies, spicy chips, TV shows, and of course, podcasts. Well, that's exactly why Thrilling Tales, the podcast, releases every chapter of its amazing stories on Mondays. so you can binge on the whole thing. So if you need something else to binge on or just something totally entertaining, get Thrilling Tales the podcast now on the Podcast One app, iTunes, or at podcastone.com.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back, my special guest, Dr. Tim Ball. We're talking about climate change and Canadians and other scary things. Tim, I'm looking at you now and I'm thinking you don't look like a very rich man. Is that because you picked the wrong side of the climate change argument?
Yes, I unfortunately, I had principles and I tried to keep them, and it's an expensive task. And it's sort of, the old joke about the politicians, I've got a very strong set of principles, but if you don't like those, I've got another set over here. And principles are expensive in this world. And Voltaire said it best when he said it's very dangerous to be right when people in authority are wrong. And of course, I chose not to go after the funding that was available through the government in the climate area. Fortunately for me, I was able to get some funding through the National Museum of Canada, and because the Canadian National Museum, the museums understand that you've got to put humans into the physical landscape, and that's always been a central theme of mine. And I mentioned earlier that I went back to university as a mature student, and Aristotle said you should get the kids out of school after they're 7 and let them experience life, then let them go back when they're 30. But we've created a school system that's a babysitting agency and a producer of little work units for the Industrial Revolution. But so I wrote an honors thesis on some philosophical considerations of man as an agent of change. And this was in the 60s. There was a book called Man's Role in Changing the Face of the Earth, and that really got me interested. So I did that, and then I did a master's thesis on environments, the actual energy environments, how energy shapes the Earth. So I was doing studies of depositional environments because I wanted the science side of it. But then my doctoral thesis was an arts and science thesis combined, because I took the Hudson Bay Company records. And the Hudson Bay Company, of course, the weather and the climate, what was going on, was very essential to their survival as a corporation.
And how far did they go back?
Oh, they go back to 1670.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
So this is one of the best documentaries.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, that was what Hubert Lamb was saying at the Climatic Research Unit. He set that up specifically because he said, look, unless you've got long-term records, you can't possibly figure out what's going on with the climate, what's causing the mechanisms. Yeah, they brought thermometers to Churchill, Manitoba as early as 1768. And they really knew what they were doing. Now, the only thing they didn't know, by the way, they didn't know that mercury freezes at minus 39 because they hadn't experienced that in England. And they very quickly switched to alcohol thermometers. But the pursuit of the money, it was more important to me to do something that could improve people's lives. So my whole idea of studying historical climate was, for example, the impact of climate on the human condition and how it triggered change. And so, of course, there was no funding for that. The funding
because nobody cares about humans, do they?
No. There's a very deep-seated anti-humanity theme in the environmental movement, and I always joke about saying, well, I'm familiar with that because my colleagues at the university used to say, if we could just get rid of all the students, it'd be a great place to work, and if we could just get rid of all the people on the planet.
Same with hospitals. If they get rid of all the sick people, they'd work much better. Yeah. Well,
there was that wonderful episode in Yes Minister, wasn't there, where they had a hospital with no patients and it worked superbly. But that's the bureaucracy thing, and so my doctoral thesis involved taking those historical records and then creating a computer code to code the data so that I could then run statistical analysis on, and just to give you an idea of how blind the world is, when I went for funding, the history side, they would say, oh, no, you're science, so go to the Science Research Council for funding. And I went to the science people. Oh, history, no, you're humanities. Get out of here. So you fell right between the cracks. But for people, their everyday life is across that gap. And so that is why I pursued it and what interested me so much. And by the way, that one of the interesting things that relate to what's going on recently was during the summer I would take seniors on tours of Europe. We do 3 weeks tours of different places, and there was always themes to them. For example, I did one Minster to Minster, Canterbury to York, and it was art, music, and literature following Jane Austen, her life. But anyway, we went to Pompeii on a couple of occasions. And we just looked at graffiti on one of the visits because when you go to Pompeii, they only allow you in different sections at different times. But one of the pieces of graffiti there says, if we get rid of this bunch of scoundrels, we just get another bunch of scoundrels. And that intrigued me because it raised the question in my mind about, are there times when people will get rid of the scoundrels? And I, from my climate research and then looking at Toynbee, who's the great historian of civilizations, and Will and Ariel Durant, I determined there were only two things. One was a failure of the food supply, which you saw with the French Revolution, because the animosity between the peasants and the aristocracy is always there, still there today, as you know. And then food riots, by the way, the Egypt thing that Obama skillfully turned into...
The Arab Spring was essentially food riots.
Was food riots, yeah. And triggered, by the way, because Obama was giving subsidies to the corn growers in America, so the price of corn went through the roof, which triggered the basic foodstuffs prices around the world to go high. So he actually triggered it. But and then you've got this thing going on in Venezuela right now with the same thing. But anyway, the other thing that the other reason that people get rid of the scoundrels is that when they sense that the scoundrels have forgotten that they are there at the will of the people. And you saw...
Isn't that always?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I mean, James I, divine right of kings, and then his son gets his head chopped off because he believed the same thing. Louis XVI, I am the state, and all of those things.
So when they get too big for their boots...
Yeah.
Right.
The people will just say, no, you're out of... And that's exactly what's happened with Trump. It's a middle-class revolution of saying to hell with the left and the right, and we're going to put somebody in there that has no illusions about who he represents.
Yes.
And
Let's talk a bit more about the bloodletting
yes.
or whatever in a moment. Yeah. But I wanted to talk to you first of all about the court case, which has been pretty much ruining your life, or certainly dominating your life for the last 6 years, is it?
Well, it's actually, it's 7 years because I've had 3 lawsuits, all from the same lawyer. And a
Canadian lawyer.
Canadian lawyer, yes, yeah. And one of the things that's going on in the legal profession is because of this attacking people to shut them up, lawsuits developed called SLAP lawsuits. Now, that's an acronym for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation, which really is a frightening concept.
What does it mean?
Well, what it means is that you file a lawsuit against somebody simply to make them stop and shut them up.
Shut them up. Okay.
Shut them up, yeah. It's exactly what it is. The lawyers are so concerned about it that in, I think it's 28 now of the U.S. states, they've passed anti-SLAP legislation to prevent this happening. And in 8 of the 10 Canadian provinces, they have anti-SLAP legislation. In British Columbia, they were going to pass anti-SLAP, and then it was blocked.
By?
My speculation, by the same people that are bringing the lawsuits against me. Because the lawyer that's bringing the lawsuits has brought lawsuits against other people like Fred Singer and other
climate skeptics. So what terrible thing did you say that justified this?
I gave a talk. Well, the first one was, I mentioned Gordon McBean, the Canadian minister who... I wrote an article about him, and I got a lawsuit. And at that point, I said, my wife and I sat down and said, no, we can't afford to fight it. So I withdrew what I wrote. Then Andrew Weaver, who is a Canadian climate modeler and has been on 4 of the IPCC reports, I wrote an article saying that the IPCC had set climate science back 30 years. Because you go and look at what Lamb was doing 30 years, it's way ahead of what we're doing today. They've actually got the whole world focused on CO2 to the distraction of real science. And so I got a lawsuit from him for that.
Well, just saying that?
Yeah.
That it set the cause of climate science back by 30 years?
Yeah.
Well, how is that a lawsuit-worthy offence?
Well, but this is
it's an opinion, isn't it?
Well, of course, yeah. But this is what the problem with these slap lawsuits is. You see, because then after that, I think less than a year later, I was in Winnipeg, Manitoba, gave a talk on the famous Michael Mann hockey stick, where he literally rewrote history. And I'm always reminded of Santayana's comment about historians being greater than God because they can change history and he can't. But and afterwards, I was interviewed by the Frontier Center for their newsletter, and he said, "Well, what do you think of Michael Mann?" And I said, "Well, he's at Penn State, but maybe he should be at State Penn." And within another 12 hours, I had another lawsuit, the third lawsuit on my hands. That's the one that's going to trial on February the 20th.
And he's not suing you for libel, then? Or?
It's defamation.
Defamation.
Defamation, right. Yeah. And of course, as you know, that what defines defamation has been a great debate in England and in many parts of the world. It's certainly part of the whole free speech argument in the United States. I mean, the lawsuits would never have been filed in the U.S., and I know that because I helped a woman by the name of Sheila Zielinski write a book called Green Gospel, and I wrote the foreword for the book. And within 2 weeks of it being published, she got a lawsuit from Gavin Schmidt, who, of course, as you know, is at NASA GISS. And
well, for the moment.
For the moment, yeah, hopefully for the moment. And so anyway, she went to a lawyer in Washington State, and he said, "Just tell them to go away." And she did that and heard no more about it. So that's how you can see the difference. What's annoying, by the way, about this lawyer in Canada is that he made his name defending free speech.
Did he?
Yeah, he made his reputation doing that, but obviously
there's more money in not free speech.
I never said that.
Yeah.
I've got enough lawsuits on my
You're in enough trouble. But
right. Yeah.
Presumably, you could just have said, what, that it was fair comment, or that it was
okay, that's a very, very interesting observation, because in Canada, and I don't know about other jurisdictions, certainly not the U.S., but in Canada, I had two ways to defend myself. I could say that it was fair comment, but if I did that, I could not have discovery. I could not force Michael Mann to disclose his documents and his work, which of course is what everybody's been after. How did he create this? What were the computer codes that he wrote and everything else? And he's been hiding that. He's been hiding under what Phil Jones, who was the director of the Climatic Research Unit, said, look, intellectual property rights. If they come after you for this stuff, just tell them it's intellectual property rights. Well, Mann actually got a court to rule that this was his intellectual property rights, even though the Attorney General of Virginia, Cuccinelli, said to the courts, look, this was taxpayer money that paid for this research. And the research has been used to influence energy and climate policy for the whole world.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, you're a scientist.
Yeah.
Isn't reproducibility one of the key facets of science?
Oh, exactly. In fact, the theme, and I assume Mann will be listening to this, and no surprise to anybody, but my lawyer said, well, what's our defense? And I said, did you ever write a math exam or test? And he said, yes. I said, what was the instructions? Show your work. Yeah, right, show your work. And Mann is refusing to do that. And as you said, reproducible results is absolutely central to science, because if other scientists can't reproduce your results, remember with the cold fusion thing, that was the big issue, wasn't it? Do you remember?
Tell me about it.
Oh well, a few years ago, they realized if they could reduce line loss, that they could save an enormous amount of energy, because you can only transmit electricity about 400 miles, and then there's so much or so little power left in the line. The Russians developed a technique of converting AC to DC and transmitting as DC and then reconverting to AC. But again, the energy input losses are so great. But if you've got, if you had a material, now at absolute zero, there's no energy loss. But of course, to attain absolute zero, the energy input's got to be enormous. But so the search was for a metal that could function at room temperature, but would have virtually no resistance to electricity. And two guys claimed that they discovered this. And of course, then immediately other scientists were saying, well, we can't reproduce their results. So it got thrown out. Incidentally, those two scientists were hired by Toyota and were working in a lab in Switzerland. So there's probably something to what they're doing. But anyway, yeah, but the reproducible results is very much a part of what's going on. But yeah, the lawsuits, I mean, for me, my wife and I sat and talked about it. And the first lawsuit, as I said, we said, no, we'll pull back and withdraw what we wrote, even though it bothered me. But the second lawsuit, we both sat down and said, because you've got to do this as a family.
Of course you have, but I mean, it must be very tough for wives.
It's huge.
What does she...
Well, let me give you an example. I mean, we're not, as I said, we're not crying. We made our decisions. We knew what we were getting into. We knew you stand up in the coconut shy, they're going to throw at you. You don't realize it's nuclear bombs that they're throwing. But we spent all of our savings before we finally found out that we could get some financial help on the internet.
So you're completely cleared out of all your retirement, all the fun you were going to have, I don't know, going to Las Vegas or whatever.
Now, luckily, we'd always had a policy of being clear of debt, so we don't have any debt, and we live on pensions, and we have for the life we enjoy. We're not, as I said, we knew what we were doing, but nonetheless, it is worrying. But one of the things that they do, the sheriffs in Canada, they deliver the summonses at 4:00 on a Friday. Because under Canadian law, you have 48 hours to respond. Well, of course, if the weekend's gone, you're scrambling on a Monday to find a lawyer. And right now, if the doorbell rings around 4:00 on Friday, my wife starts crying. And it's that, yeah. I mean, that's pretty emotional to talk about, but it's part of what these people are doing. I mean, it's really, to me, it's evil. It's truly evil, if you're trying to silence somebody like that. And of course, the other part of it is that other scientists have watched what I've gone through and saying, I'm keeping my mouth shut. I'm not going to say anything.
Let's talk about this a bit more, because you hear people like Michael Mann saying this, people like Phil Jones of the CRU saying this. They say that there is a conspiracy of skeptics to ruin their lives, to question their science and their integrity tonight. They're always playing the martyr card, aren't they? Yeah. But what have you seen as a skeptical scientist in your time?
Well, it's the victim card, and the problem I have with those people like Michael Mann and Phil Jones and others is that what they were really doing was exposed in the leaked emails. That in fact that they knew exactly what they were doing, and they were coordinating to predetermine the science and get the science that they wanted for the political agenda. And I mean the fact that when the email hacking went on at East Anglia, Jones immediately called the police. And the reason for that, as I understand, is that if the emails were hacked, they couldn't be used in a British court. But if they were leaked from inside, they could be. So and of course, Jones immediately also called, by the way, the PR person who was in charge of the News of the World and the phone hacking.
Neil Wallace.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they brought him in on the case very quickly. And so, and Mann is playing the victim card now. He's under attack and so on. But as I said, their own words have destroyed that argument.
But compared to the suffering of people like you and Willie Soon, give me some other examples of people who's.
Well, the Willie Soon, and one of the ones you don't hear about was Sally Baliunas, who was working with Willie, and Sally actually quit the whole science. She got out of it. She went and became a shepherd because she couldn't take it anymore. And I've read the emails she got. They are really vile.
What was her crime?
Well, her crime was that she and Willie published an article which proved from the historical record that the medieval warm period did exist. And the person who attacked her, and he set it up through a breakfast meeting in Harvard University, was John Holdren, who's Obama's science czar. Holdren is behind so much of all of this because Holdren goes back to publishing with Ehrlich, Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb, because although the climate issue has become a major focus in the CO2, what it's really all about is the Club of Rome's argument, the neo-Malthusian argument, that because Malthus said the world would outgrow the food population. Well, the Club of Rome said the world would outgrow all the resources. And so they published that book, Limits to Growth, which, of course, proved to be absolutely wrong. Well, Holdren published with Ehrlich. And I mean, these guys were proposing eugenics. They were proposing compulsory abortions to reduce the world population. And that was the underlying theme of the Club of Rome, which Maurice Strong, of course, was part of. Strong became the conduit from the Club of Rome to the United Nations and implemented all of these ideas in the Agenda 21. And so John Holdren has I mean, it's frightening to read what he was writing with Ehrlich. And in fact, he makes the argument that you could use the American Constitution by saying, look, the threat of overpopulation is so serious that this justifies the use of the Constitution to require compulsory abortions. So these are truly frightening people.
So these are bad people. I think in the final section we should talk about the fight back, which is beginning now, and your court case is going to be part of that, and also I think so is the Trump administration. You're listening to Delingpole with this week's special guest, Dr. Tim Ball.
My name is Anthony Ponce, and I used to be a reporter on NBC, but I got tired of being part of traditional news media, so I quit that job and became a Lyft driver. And now I interview whatever passengers end up in my back seat. So if you want to hear the best stories that real people tell me when we're driving around the city, check out my podcast. It's called Backseat Rider on podcast1.com, the Podcast One app, and iTunes.
Stay tuned for 60-second AP News headlines.
AP Update, I'm Diane Kepley. Questions are swirling in Washington about the contacts between Trump administration officials and the Russians.
Was General Flynn directed or authorized to do what he did? What was the extent of his conversations and contacts with Russia? Who else from the Trump administration, transition, or campaign had contact with the Russians?
Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and others are calling for an independent investigation to get the answers to those questions. There is pushback from President Trump. This morning, he's lashing out at the news media, saying the fake news media is going crazy with what he calls their conspiracy theories and blind hatred. He adds in his tweet, the Russian connection nonsense is an attempt to cover up mistakes made in Hillary Clinton's losing campaign. Meantime, in Moscow, a Kremlin spokesman is denying reports about intercepted phone calls between intelligence officials and members of the Trump presidential campaign. AP Update.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
So welcome back to my special guest, Dr. Tim Ball. We'll talk in a moment about the fight back against all this climate evil that your fellow Canadian Maurice Strong's started. But before we do that, I just wanted to hear a bit more about this court case that you're fighting. It's being financed, I understand, by a sort of benefactor in New York. Is that right?
Well, two people. Obviously, I spent my own money initially, and then
how much have you spent?
The total bill, not just my spending, but it's about $1.5 million so far in legal fees. Oh yeah, it's
that's the sound of my jaw hitting the floor.
Yeah, no,
people will be shocked by that. That's so your savings have gone.
Yeah. And then also a fellow by the name of John O'Sullivan, who you might know in England.
Journalist.
Yeah, he helped me set up a website with a PayPal, and then people contributed to that, and they were very good contributions. But then through Joe Bast at the Heartland Institute in Chicago.
The evil Heartland Institute, which doesn't care about anyone. But
no, exactly. And so he arranged with a benefactor in New York who's helped out considerably because he's made money, but he's also a scientist in the financial world. And he knows about computer models, and he's very upset about the misuse of computers and computer models. And so he's been helping since, and that's made all the difference.
Not all billionaires are funding the wrong.
No, exactly. And it's interesting because what it did with my lawyers, and normally courts will not entertain science cases because it's your paper against my paper, and they correctly say we're not qualified to make those kind of judgments. But in this case, what we're arguing is it's your corrupted paper against my paper. And so it makes it a whole different thing. And we were originally just going to argue that what Michael Mann did by withholding his data and creating this false statistics, that the medieval warm period did exist. And that goes back, by the way, to the attacks on Sally Baliunas and Willie, because Holdren held a breakfast meeting at Harvard. They were regular breakfast meetings, and that the attacks on Willie and Sally were just absolutely unbelievable. It's all documented, and Sally got out of the game. But anyway, back to my case. I could either say what I said was fair comment, but we couldn't get discovery of the information, which is critical, or I could argue that what I said was the truth. By saying what I said was the truth, we then can get discovery. We can force Michael Mann to disclose his computer codes and all the things that people want. But the risk is if I lose the case, they can take everything I own and fine me to boot.
Right.
So there was a risk involved. But again, the principle is more important of forcing this man to show what he did and how corrupt it was.
Oh, but I'm so glad they're hoovering the floor. This is going to really help the sound quality.
Yes.
So yeah. So you could stand to lose everything, and it sounds to me like you're throwing in everything to the mix. You've got the whole history of the climate change scam appearing in court in a courtroom in Vancouver.
Well, this changed with my lawyers because they're initially, of course, lawyers try to contain a case. They just do the minimum to get you found innocent. But as they looked at what was going on, they said, look, Michael Mann is at the center of a much larger corruption of science. And of course, that's what I've been arguing all along. So they basically said, and we agreed, okay, he's giving us the courtroom. Let's use it to put the whole of the climate science on trial.
So you've essentially put your finances and your rest of your life at risk,
right,
by having this court case,
right,
in order to finally...
Yeah, to expose what's gone on, because, I mean, the damage it's done to people's lives and so on. It's really, as you know, it's in the trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
And the imposition of green economies on developing countries. I mean, one of the things that bothered me for the longest time was they had the moral high ground. Oh,
they claim to have the moral.
Well, they claim to have. Yeah, we care about the environment. You don't, and you're giving comfort to the polluters and all of these things that were thrown at me. Well, that started to change when Prime Minister Modi of India. He did a study, he got a group to look at it and said, look, you're telling us that the global temperature might go up a fraction of a degree in 70 years, and you're not even certain about that. He said, I've got a third of my people without any electricity at all. That suddenly changed the moral high ground of the thing. Senator Inhofe, of course, at Oklahoma had fought valiantly, but Inhofe had the problem that Oklahoma is an oil state, so it was his motives were suspect. But then the latest thing that's really changed it is Malcolm Roberts, who is a senator.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I knew Malcolm contacted me about 6 years ago, and I helped him set up a thing called the Galileo movement, because what happens is when other people start to look at the climate science, they can't believe what they're seeing.
Yeah.
And so they kind of seek comfort in, well, am I crazy, or is this really this bad? And so I helped set up a group in Calgary called the Friends of Science, who came to the same conclusions and problems. So Malcolm, we set up the Galileo movement. Then Malcolm said, okay, I'm going to run for office, and he got elected as the Senator of Queensland. Incidentally, under the whole new pattern of getting away from traditional Tory Labour things into regional governments, because Trump essentially ran the American Party. It wasn't the Republican Party; it was the American Party, and so Malcolm ran for the Senate, but 3 years prior to that, we got going on this idea of empirical evidence, because the whole scam has been created and it's a circular argument. They say, well, CO2 increases, the temperature will increase. Well, how do you know that works? Well, we built a computer model and we increased CO2 and the temperature went up. That therefore proves our original point. It's the classic circular argument. And you know, the old thing about GIGO, G-I-G-O, garbage in, garbage out. Well, for me now it's become gospel in, gospel out, right, because it's a religion. And so Malcolm was the first politician not to challenge other politicians or the environmentalists, but to go after the bureaucrats that Maurice Strong had used at these government agencies. So he went to the CSIRO, which is a sub-brand or part of the Australian government climate change thing, and said, okay, show us your empirical evidence. We don't want output of computer models. That's not actual evidence. And of course they couldn't do it. And the report that they submitted to Malcolm, and we went through this when I was in Australia a month ago. I said to Malcolm, I said, I'm tempted to say it's sophomoric, but I wouldn't insult sophomores that way, you know. I mean, it was unbelievable. But this is the very first time. And now what we've got with the Trump regime and I love what Trump did where he talked to Al Gore and he talked to DiCaprio.
Because he cares, doesn't he?
Oh, of course he cares. But then he immediately, and it's sort of like the old wrestling thing, you know, you pretend to be hurt and then all of a sudden you turn around and slam dunk the enemy. I mean, and he did that by appointing Scott Pruitt to the head of the EPA. The other thing that's interesting about it is that Myron Ebell, who was at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, was told a month before the election that his job was to say, how can we deregulate the EPA? That's a sign of what Trump is doing, because like any developer, he knows you've got to have your materials and your trades and everybody ready to go on day one. And so we've got this opportunity now to appear in Washington. Malcolm's here from Australia, and Tony Heller, who is just a genius with showing how numbers are cooked.
He's been a previous star guest of the podcast.
Oh, has he?
Tony Heller,
yeah.
Stroke Stephen Goddard.
Yeah.
So we are, in about 5 minutes after this interview ends, we're all going to troop off to some briefing room in Congress.
Yes.
And we're going to start preparing...
Yeah. It's actually the Dirksen building, and Senator Dirksen once said that in politics you get elected, you get re-elected, and you get even. That's the
and this is going to be the get even moment.
This is the get even moment.
Did you expect to live to see this moment?
No, but I prayed for it. I really did. One of the turning points, of course, was again back to the heartland. The conference in New York in 2010 was the first Heartland Climate Conference. It was the first Get-To conference ever. And I got up, and my opening comment was, I waited 40 years for this, and the whole room erupted.
But I went to the one, I think, the year afterwards, or the 2 years after, in Chicago, and I still very much felt like we were beleaguered.
Oh, absolutely.
We were written off as loons.
Yeah. Well, because one of the things that the left do, I mean, they love to pigeonhole people politically. They put you in this pigeonhole, that pigeonhole, but they also marginalize you. They marginalize you as an individual. So me, for example, and one of the reasons I was such a threat was they couldn't say I wasn't qualified. And then also, I had a God-given ability to explain the complexities of the science in a way the public could understand. That was a real danger. But then they'll also marginalize you into groups. So, for example, if you dare to ask any questions about Obama, you were a birther. Or if you dare to question global warming, you were a global warming skeptic.
Denier.
The denier came later.
OSC.
Yeah, see, because initially we were global warming skeptics, and then people like me were going out and saying, but all scientists are skeptics. If you're not a skeptic, you're not a scientist. And then the global warming thing started to fizzle out because the CO2 kept going up, but the temperature started to level off. That's what Thomas Huxley, by the way, described over 100 years ago as the great tragedy of science, is a beautiful hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. Really summarize it well. And then, of course, when it became climate change, which then encompassed anything what was going up, going down, didn't matter. It's all due to humans. And then I became a climate change denier with all the Holocaust connotations of that. And so this name calling and marginalizing, the more general one, if they can't think of a clever one like Bertha, you're just a conspiracy theorist. Well, I'm sorry, but conspiracies occur. They really occur, and it is not a conspiracy to call a conspiracy, but this is the crazy mixed up world that we're in, that these people have created.
Thank you, Dr. Timble. You were listening to Delingpole with this week's special guest, Dr. Timble. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Thank you, and goodbye.